Hey guys, thanks for watching my data videos channel. If you like what you see, subscribe down below with that alarm bell. Today I'm going to talk about Web API and how easy it is to secure a Web API. We're going to talk about authentication and then authorization. We'll use JSON web tokens to authenticate, and then we'll use the identity to authorize. And let's jump right into it. Create a new ASP.NET Core web application, and then choose ASP.NET Core web application once again and click Next. Here, give it a name. I'm just going to leave it as web application 2. That's fine. And here we're going to choose ASP.NET Core web API. Leave HTTPS configured. Now, as far as authentication goes, it does have individual user accounts here, but as you can see, it's meant for Azure connections. So we're just leave it as no authentication. We're going to add it ourselves, okay? So go ahead and click create and make sure you leave that open API support. Go ahead and navigate to your startup.cs file and go to your configure services method. Right here at the top, you're going to add a key, which is encoding.ascii.getBytes, and here you're going to put in a big unique string. Now, long term, I don't recommend keeping this in your startup method because you're going to have a copy of this also in your controller where you have your secret method where you're trying to get the encrypted data out. So you could put that in a config file somewhere, in properties somewhere, wherever it is that you like to keep your secrets. But for now, we're just going to put it here for the purposes of this demonstration. Now for your encoding, just control dot using system.text. Press enter. So now we're going to add a service. So services.add authentication. And here you're going to do X and then do your lambda. And oftentimes we do your lambda, you got to control Z to undo because Visual Studio tries to put in other things after you put your equal sign, but that's okay. Just control Z and keep going. Your equal sign, fill out your lambda. We're going to do some curly brackets because we want to do two things. We're going to assign two things to that X. The first one, just remember default. Type in default. The first choice that pops up is default authentication scheme and challenge scheme. We're going to do both of those. And then this next one, you'll have to type in JSON Web Token bearer defaults, so JWT bearer defaults, and then control dot on that, and using Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT bearer. Dot, and there's your authentication scheme. All right, grab you a semicolon there, and now X dot, here's your challenge scheme, and give it the same value. Let it know it's JSON Web Token defaults authentication scheme again. We've set up this authentication service in our configure services. Let it know we're going to use the JSON Web Token bearer defaults, but we haven't really done enough configuration with it. So I'm going to put something here that you've probably seen in some other examples of bearer tokens across the internet that maybe were not specific to Web API. We'll get to the specific parts here in a moment. This is kind of some code that you've seen across the internet, but it's important. I'll point out a couple pieces here. Right here, we're going to put a to-do because once we add authorization to this authentication, we'll be filling that in there with some claims. But just for authentication part, it's important to note here that we are requesting a symmetric key. So I'm going to hit control dot on that to use the Microsoft Identity Tokens model there. And it's important to note also that we are saving that token. So we'll come back to this. This was important, but let's keep going. Let's scroll down to your pipeline down here, which the configure method. And before we authorize, we want to authenticate. So once you add app.use authentication. All right, let's add a controller. So go to your controllers, right click, add controller, and you're going to go up to API empty, and hit add, and give it some kind of interesting name. I'm just going to use the default of values. And we're going to want to give it an attribute of authorize. Control dot on that. Using Microsoft ASP.NET Core.authorization sounds good. And then here we're going to want a few methods. We're going to want a registered method for once we use authorization, but we're going to want a get token or login method that will get that JSON web token. And we're going to want maybe a authenticated data access and a non-authenticated. So let's build those now. So first, let's do a just a, I don't know, my get fruits method and a get authenticated fruit, so we could tell the difference. So this one's going to be a public action result get fruits. In there, we're going to take in a username, or no, this is the unauthenticated, so it doesn't need to take in anything. It should be a get. So HTTP get sounds good. What would you say it was called? Get fruits. And in here, you can just return. We could have a string list. So we could have list type string my list equal to new list, and you could put like apples, bananas in here. I won't bore you with that. So let's return our HTTP verb here, or our action verb for okay. If you haven't seen that, it's really handy. And we'll put in an object, my list. And then let's create the same thing for our authenticated version. Now, one thing on your unauthenticated is you do need another attribute. You need allow anonymous. We're also going to need allow anonymous on our get token method, because when someone goes to log in, they at least need to be able to attempt to log in before you tell them they're not allowed to access that method, right? You don't have to already have your JSON web token in your request because you haven't got it yet. So there's going to be a few anonymous methods in here. One will just be our testing method get fruits. The get fruits authenticated obviously will not have that. And let's just call this organic. You know, organic always costs more, so that should be our authenticated. All right. So let's close these up here. And actually, I'll hit F5 just to show you before we get too far into this what it looks like where we're at. So the new WebAPI template uses the Swagger interface, which is super nice. You'll see why very quickly. So the one it came with was weather forecast. You can click try it out. It shows you all this cool stuff. Execute. It even has this curl, which if you don't know what a curl is, you could drop that into a Windows command prompt, and it'll return the same thing that this website's returning. I won't waste any more of your time with that one though. So here's our unauthenticated one. So if I try that out and execute, you'll see that it returned apples and bananas. Now, if I do the authenticated one and I try it out, execute, it returned unauthorized, which is exactly what we wanted. And because I did okay, it's still success there. If I did on something else, I could have returned a different response. All right, let's go ahead and create our token now. So going back here, we're going to minimize these. And now we're going to do a post. So HTTP post get token. It's kind of like our login method, right? So it's going to be public, and this one's going to be async. You'll see why soon. Action results. Oops. And now here we do want a parameter because they got to pass in their username and password, right? And I like to put this, or you'll see in other examples too, from body. It means it's going to be in the body of the request. And we're going to do this in Fiddler too later, so you'll totally see that. And now we're going to have a class that contains the user and password. So let's just create one. Let's call it my login model. Type my login model. And let's create that class. So actually I'm going to stop running this and go up here to application, add class. We'll call it my login model type. And the identity core is what we're going to use for authorization soon, uses email instead of username. So I'm just going to use email just to save us that step later. So prop tab string tab email. Now we can copy and paste that line for password. Save that and close it. It's already referenced here, which is nice. So now let's compare what we got against this and see if it's what we need. So do an if statement. If my login model dot email is equal to, and this is just a placeholder, folks. Once we add authorization, I'm going to replace this hard-coded string with something from the database. But for now, let's put Jones at msn.com. If that's your email, wow, that's lucky, but unlikely, so I made that up. And my login model.password is equal to my password 123. Then we'll go ahead and return the token. Otherwise, we'll return that same verbiage. Actually, let's return unauthorized. That would be more appropriate, right? And another block of the code here where I'm just going to paste something in that you've probably seen elsewhere on the web. And oop, I just remembered, got to zoom in here for those mobile users, so I apologize. There we go. So this here is a block of code. Like I said, you've probably seen it before. And what you've got is you're creating a token handler, a key, token descriptor. You're basically building the JSON web token, and you get to assign it any claims that you want, because once they try to log back in using that token, those claims will be in the HTTP context, and you're going to decide whether or not those claims should allow that user to access the methods based on roles. So let's just go ahead and control dot on each of these here, and I'll go through them in a little bit more detail. So I'm control dot using system.text, control dot using Microsoft Identity Model.tokens, control dot using security.system.claims, system.security claims, control dot here. Actually, this is going to be my login model. I did it previously and I called it Chris login model because my name is Chris. All right, so as you can see, so we're getting a JSON Web Security Token Handler. This is the same key that you had out there in your startup.cs. So you're not going to want to hard code this. You're going to put it somewhere in a file, obviously. Getting the token descriptor, listing out your claims, and then here's how long you want the token to expire for. Because when you're going to be running this on your IIS, obviously that app pool is not going to reset every day. You're going to have it probably run as long as you can. So you might want to have it to where they don't have to log in every time, as long as they remember it in their browser. Maybe you could put 7 days there, and then assigning credentials with a symmetric key. And then we're writing out the token and returning it here. All right, Shift Alt Enter to bring it back into view here. And I'm just going to zoom out a little bit, just long enough to see what this error is here. So it's saying, oh, it's just letting us know that it's an async and we're not returning a task. All right, so let's just change this to task, type action result, get token. Excellent. All right, so we're going to add a lot more to this method here in a little while. All right, we did forget one thing on this method to get token, and that is allow anonymous. Got to be able to get in there to log in. So I'm going to hit F5. I'll show you what we've got so far before we add any more. So our get for it's authenticated, we first have to get the token. So if I click post here, try it out, and execute, it's going to pop into our application, hit F10, and it's going to take from the body email and password as string, which isn't going to match Jones or password 123. It's going to return unauthorized. Unauthorized, as we expected, right? So let's go ahead and copy those in as our user and password. Jones for the email, and you gotta love this Swagger interface here that's allowing us to do this. Hit execute. It's going to get inside our block here. It's going to create claims, create a JSON web token, and return that. Boom, there you go. There's your token. So we're going to take this information and we're going to use this token now to get inside this Fruits authenticated method. Now, I don't think it's possible to do it with the Swagger interface for this one, so we're going to use an external tool called Fiddler, which is free. But just to show you, if I was trying to get in it directly, we get unauthorized. We wouldn't even hit the breakpoint. So just popping back in here, the method that we're trying to get to, I'll put a breakpoint here. And now let's switch over to Fiddler. All right, so once you're inside Fiddler, click the Composer tab and change it to HTTP 1.2. Make sure HTTP verb is set to get, because that's what we have for our method. And in here in the body of the request, you're going to do authorization : space bearer token, and then paste your token there. Get the URL from the browser now. So I'm going to go back to my browser and scroll up. We can collapse these as an accordion. Let's go to the Get Fruits Authenticated. And if you hit try it out, hit execute, it's going to give you the URL. I'm sure you could figure it out. It's just API, the controller name, the method name. But I'm going to copy the whole thing and go back to Fiddler and paste it up here. And now we're going to hit execute. And boom, we got inside the method. I'm going to hit F5. And if you look over here on the left, you might be able to find it. Just look for localhost, double click it. The more things you see on the left just indicates you got more applications open making web requests, so just ignore all my other junk. As you can see, the top is the request, the bottom is the response, and it gave us this JSON string here: organic apples, organic bananas. So back in Visual Studio, I've got 2 projects there, but that was exactly what we returned. All right, so what we've accomplished so far is the JSON web token has been created, and we've used the JSON web token to get back into a method that requires authentication. You can see there's no allow anonymous here. So what we're going to add now is identity to this mix, so that we're not just hard coding the user and password. We're going to need a register method, and then we're going to need to be able to query that database using Entity Framework. All right, let's start. Okay, so there's 2 commands we're going to run in the package manager console here. And I'll just comment them up top so you can see it. The first is to install package Microsoft.ASP Core Diagnostics Entity Framework Core. These are just ones I found useful. Then we're going to install the Entity Framework tools. You want to be able to see the errors, as they come out in your interface too. Anyways, so now that we've installed those, we're going to do a little bit of scaffolding. So go up to your application, right-click, add, and now here we're going to do new scaffolded item. And you're going to choose identity and hit add. There are other ways, I guess, to do this. You could probably create a new MVC project and copy things over one at a time if you did the individual user accounts there, but for me, I found this was super easy. And this actually, we're going to add a lot of things we don't need. So for those watching that have done this and found, I was able to uncheck a lot of these things and it still worked, you might want to let others know. It might be helpful. But for me, I just come in here super quick. I just click that and I hit both these pluses. Add the data context class for SQL Server. Hit plus to add a user class. It's gonna create that for us and hit add. And this might take a few minutes. All right, I fast forwarded to finish installing that, but we have two more commands that we're going to run. So I'm going to put them up here for you to look at in case you pause your video or something. So add migration. So we're going to create a migration in SQL Server, and I have running here a local instance of SQL Server called SQL Express. So you might want to download that if you haven't already. And my tool for accessing it is SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio. So first let's run add migration, create identity schema. Since this is entity framework and we're creating a migration because we did the code before the database, this is code first migration. I'll press enter there. And that's creating the classes to do the migration. And now to actually execute the migration or to create the database, we're going to do update-database. And I'll put that here. Now open your SQL Server Management Studio, right click on databases and click refresh. I already did it, so mine's here. It's Web Application 2. And if you go down to tables, you should see all the identity tables should show up for you. And the one that most important for getting started is this users table. Okay, let's go back to our project. All right, let's look at a couple things that this migration did or that this identity scaffolding did before we make changes, okay? So the first thing that's important to take a look at is if you go into the startup here and you scroll to the top, you're not going to see that DB context that you might have seen in MVC in the past. Instead, it stuck it inside areas, identity hosting startup. So it's a second startup file. So in here, you're going to see those two classes that we hit the plus on to create when we did our identity scaffolding, which is the Web Application 2 user, Web Application 2 context. Yours is whatever you called it, right? You could actually move these to the startup.cs, but it doesn't matter. What does matter is that you don't have a duplicate because you're going to see some strange errors. It might take a while to figure out where they're coming from. If you're adding DB context, and you're adding default identity or adding identity or DB context, if you're adding it in both this startup and startup.cs, you're going to see weird errors. It can take a lot of troubleshoot. So don't do it. Just leave it where it's at. It's fine there, or copy it over here. But if you copy it over here, make sure to remove it from identity hosting startup. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, go ahead and get your user file into your clipboard, just the name of the class, and it's over here in data, by the way, and it inherits from identity user. This is where you can put some custom user information, because I'm sure you're going to want to at some point put more than just what identity comes with. But put that into your clipboard, come back to startup.cs, and we're going to make that full screen. So scroll down to where we put our to-do under our JSON Web Token bearer on token validated, because right here is where we're going to identify what claims are related to that token, and we're going to determine if this person is able to access those secure methods based on the token that they've provided. So right here, we're going to access the context. So I'll put in the comments that thing we put into the clipboard. Oops. And we're going to access the context. So context dot HTTP context dot, and we want, this is going to be our user tool set. So let's just call it our user machine. So let's look for the requested services, required services, get required service. And here, right in here, we're gonna want that identity user service. And that's actually called user manager You might recognize that if you've done identity for MVC and .NET Framework. But anyways, control dot on that, and you're going to use using Microsoft ASP.NET Core.Identity, and then that is going to be of this type of this user class that you created earlier when you did your scaffolding. And Visual Studio likes to add these spaces, so just cut those out like that, and do another control dot here, using your application name .identity data. And we're missing some brackets here, parentheses here, control dot. Oh, wait, we're good. All right. So now you've got your user machine. So to identify the user, we could use the user machine, and then you've got your choices to get user. Well, we want to get it by something that's been supplied. So choose get user async, and here we're going to actually reference the context.http context.user, which is going to give us our claims information. And I believe there's quite a bit you could do in here, but I'm just going to be checking if we found a user with this that we've looked at or not. So if it's null, then we're going to go ahead and fail it with unauthorized. Time to go back to our controller and add a little bit of code that's specific to our authorization. So if you go over to your controllers and your values controller, I think at this point we're going to need a constructor. So what I like to do is just clean things up, is just to kind of minimize down to the method headers to make sure I don't already have something like that, which I don't. And there's two things that we need to add, which is a user manager and a sign-in manager. And I have what I pasted is application 1 because I did this earlier. And then your database context, which we created earlier. So let's go ahead and take a look at where we get that from. So going back up to areas, identity, and then if you go into your let's see, web application context, this is going to be your database class. This is your context. So grab your application context file name from here, and you're going to put that here. And control dot using your application name dot data. And then as far as the user manager, that comes with identity. So using Microsoft ASP.NET Core.Identity. And then as far as your user class, that's going to be over here in the same folder. You can get the name from there and paste that here. And control dot again using identity.data. All right, so we're going to inject the user manager and the sign-in manager, which are helpful classes from identity, into this class, and we're going to access our database that we've set up. So let's create a constructor. So public values controller, and right in here we're going to have these three things. So sometimes it's easier just to paste everything, but I'm going to do it like this. Make it bigger for you guys. And lined up. So next we got the user manager. I just take the underscores off. And then we've got the sign-in manager. Take that underscore off of there. And can close that out. It's giving me an error, probably because we haven't finished putting it together. I don't think it's that space. And now let's assign these things. So db context equal to db context, user manager, sign-in manager, sign-in manager. And now we have successfully used dependency injection to get access to identities, powerful methods that we'll use for authenticating and signing in. So let's start with the method that we already have, which is the getToken method. So here we're going to use the ideology that we're going to get the user that already exists with this email address, since emails are unique in this identity database. Then we're going to see if that user in the database has the same password as the one that was passed in. So first, let's get the user if it exists by using our context. So var user equal to dbcontext.users. And then you could do .where or something like that. I'm just going to do first or default where, and we'll do this lambda here. And once again, you got to control C that because Visual Studio takes it away. Where the email is equal to what's in your login model from the body of the request dot email. Now, if the user is not null, and we've at least found a user, whether they've supplied the right password or not, we'll use that powerful sign-in manager that I was talking about earlier. So let's try sign in result is equal to sign in manager dot check password sign in async. And because async, we're going to be awaiting this. Remember, I told you earlier, I'd tell you why we're making an async method. It's because the sign in manager and the user manager use async methods. So check password and sign in async, and it wants the user, which we just found, hopefully, and the password, which is in the login model. And then it wants to know whether to lock out on failure. For this example video, we'll just put false, but you can put whatever you'd like there. Okay, so now you can take a look at that sign-in result. So if sign-in result dot succeeded, then we want to proceed, right? Otherwise, we want to let them know that they weren't authorized to proceed. So we could do return okay, failed, try again. And the reason we're just using okay is so it still returns the status 200, because if I returned unauthorized, I kind of feel like we're saying you weren't authorized to get to this method. Whereas in reality, I think if they got this far, it's kind of like there was authentication issues. So we're saying okay, but you failed to sign in. Anyways, let's keep going. So if the username and password was correct, now we're in here, and I think at this point we can put all this logic in there. So I'm going to remove that. And we'll put that right in here. And then you can remove the stuff that you had here before, because that's already covered. And now there's an error here, which is saying not all code paths return a value. So the easiest way to kind of figure that out, I think, is to collapse these if statements, but let's take a quick peek. So we return okay here, we return failed here, but that's all within that if statement. If there was no user found to begin with, then I think we want to return failed out here as well. Some sort of failed. You're welcome to use whatever verb you want for your application. It's time to build the register method, because we can't really get too far if there's no accounts in the system. So I'm going to collapse these methods here so we can get a good picture of what's here, and let's add the register method. So again, it's an anonymous method. Everything's anonymous except for our getFruits authenticated, it looks like, but it's an anonymous method so they can register. And it's going to be async as well, because just like the getToken method that used the sign-in manager, which has asynchronous methods in it, this one uses the user manager, and we want to use those asynchronous methods to register, to create a new user. So let's begin. So let's do public async task. Just like before, we might as well just use an action result. And here we're going to call it register. And just like here, I'm going to use from body, which means I'm telling them to put the username and password in the body of the request. And there's no reason why we need a new model, so at least from what I can think of, so we can just put that there. And of course, you guys obviously add whatever you want to that model. It doesn't have to be just user and password. If there's more information required for your application at registration, you can collect it right away there. If you don't have a global try-catch in your application, you're definitely going to want to wrap the register and get token methods in a try-catch so that you can log the errors that are happening. But I'm going to skip that for this demo. It's just something, a good reminder to always have a global try-catch anyways. So let's exit the full screen. I want to get the name of my user class because we're going to need to create a user class in order to use that with the user manager, not just the login model. So we can create it from the information in the login model though. So let's call it web application to user, lower W sounds good to me. Create a new instance of that. And then let's assign it, there's a whole bunch more values in here because it matches the database, right? But we're just going to assign it the values from the login model. So let's start with email because that's the unique field, the key. My login model.email. And now you don't want to pass in the password here. You'll see why in a minute. Oh, I mean, it's the password is hashed and you don't provide it at this step. So, but what you can do is you can get that username field populated. And personally, I just use the email for the username. You're primarily just going to use the email, but there is a username field in the database. So now there's one other one here that depending on how you set up your application, you may want to set. If you want to write code to have them, receive an email and send back a code and set up that kind of authentication before they use your API, then you don't want to do this. But if your whole registration process is them just signing up, then and you don't want them to have to confirm an email address, then turn this off here, and it's going to make things easier for you. Okay. Now we can use that user manager to authenticate. So user manager dot create async, and this is going to be an async call again. So the result equals await, and you're going to pass it in the user, which we just created here, and here's the password, and it's going to hash it out for you. Excellent. Now we'll take a look at that result, and if it was successful, then we need to let them know. So I just send back an OK, register success. There's not much to that. Otherwise, Identity likes to put the errors into an array, so we probably want to return each one of the errors so they could see them all. Depends on how you want to do it, especially if this is kind of in a debugging kind of step. I don't want to waste too much of your time on this, so I'm just going to paste something in here and explain it super fast. So if you build a string builder, you can loop through all the errors that might be in the result and add them to a string. And actually, you don't need this line at all. Add them to a string and put it out there for a developer to see, or maybe you want to send an email, log it, I don't know. But that's what I did here. And then I did a response, once again at 200, and I just said that you failed to register, and here's why. All right, why don't you hit F5 and take a look at what we've done so far. Okay, so let's hit register, try it out, and we're going to enter in an email address. So I'll enter in a test email here. I'm sure it doesn't exist anymore. It's an old school one I had back in the day. And then let's give it a password of, let's see, ABC, my pass, 123. Because we're using Identity, it's got some defaults in here, so it already knows you have to have capital letters, you have to have numbers. So if I didn't do this right now, it's already going to return an error. So I'm going to go ahead and execute and register success. Let's take a look at that in the database. So select the top 1,000 users and oh, there it is. And it's got a password that's been hashed for us. Wonderful. Okay, so now let's go back and let's try to log in and get a token with that. So try that out, see if we did that correctly. Put in your user and password. Execute. Okay, we're in our token method and we did find a user and we're going to try to sign in. Uh-oh, sign in failed. Let's see why. In the output, user cannot sign in without a confirmed account. Well, I think we said earlier that you can definitely require them to have to validate their logins with email, and we did turn it off in one place. There is one other place that you have to turn it off. You go to Identity Hosting Startup over here where it adds the default identity. By default, it adds this options.require confirmed accounts. So if you change that to false, that'll take care of that error. So let's run it again. And we've already registered, so now we'll go ahead and get the token. So let's put that back in here. And hit execute. Back in here this time. F10, F10, F10. All right, here we are again, sign in manager, and this time it succeeded. So we'll go ahead and assign our claims and create a token for a day. And here's the token here. So we're going to get that token. And now let's go ahead and do our fruits authenticated. So I'll come back to Fiddler like we did earlier. Go to Composer, and I'll paste in the token because I stopped and started it. We can't use the token that we had before, but the rest of it should be okay. I'll hit execute, and boom, we got back in here. Now, one thing to note, if we were to expand onto this video, is we might want to add here some additional attributes for roles, like if you're administrator, what type of user are you? Are you allowed to use this method? And that just all you have to do that is to add the claims where we were looking at claims earlier. I claim that I'm administrator, etc. But this gets you authenticated and it allows you to register and use the identity, user, and password. And you can get the rest of that role stuff from tutorials that are specific to identity, because it's not any different at that point from MVC to WebAPI. But anyways, so we got in here, hit F5, and there it is there. Organic apples, organic bananas. I'd clicked on the wrong one. All right. Well, if you're still with me, it's been a long video. Thank you so much for bearing with the bearer token to the end. And hopefully you learned something from this. We covered two different things, the JSON web tokens and using identity for authorization. So we did authentication and we did authorization for a web API, and we did a little bit of scaffolding. So that's it for today. Thank you so much. Take care.